Amidst the grief-filled funeral for a 5-year-old girl, a black raven appeared and began to peck at the deceased's mouth. What happened next left everyone in shock. The afternoon was quiet in the small Mexican village where Lexi, a girl of just 5 years old, lived. The dusty streets were filled with a calm, only broken by the whispers of the wind caressing the treetops and the distant laughter of children playing. Life here was simple, slow, almost as if time moved to the rhythm of the steps of the elderly who sat in the plazas. For Lexi, her world revolved around two things: her mother, always loving and attentive, and the figure of her father, who, although often absent, occupied a huge place in her small heart. Her father was a sailor, a man who spent weeks, sometimes months, away from home, sailing through distant waters that Lexi could only imagine. But every time he returned, he brought with him not only his presence, but a piece of the outside world that she so longed to know. With each return, Lexi's father became a hero, a storyteller, and a bearer of wonders. From his hands came seashells that resonated with the echo of the Caribbean Sea, small statuettes carved from dark wood that, he said, came from countries so far away they didn't appear on the village maps. Lexi kept each gift as a treasure. For her, they were not just objects. They were windows to unknown worlds, pieces of adventures that her father had lived and now shared with her. However, what she valued most were not the things, but the stories her father brought with him. "You know, Lexi," he would say as she listened, fascinated, "in the ocean there are stars that are not in the sky, and they are so bright that if you see them, you will never forget them." That day, Lexi knew her father was about to arrive. She had been counting the minutes for days, waiting with an impatience that her mother tried to calm with a, "It won't be long, daughter. Be patient." But patience was what the girl least had. She had stationed herself in front of the wooden fence that bordered her house, her eyes fixed on the dirt road, waiting to see the tall, familiar figure of her father approaching. And then she saw him. "Papa!" she shouted, her voice filling the air like a bell of joy. She ran towards him, her little legs moving as fast as they could. Her father opened his arms and lifted her into the air, spinning her around as they both laughed. The dust of the road rose around them, but neither Lexi nor her father noticed. At that moment, the world was just for the two of them. After a while, Lexi stopped and looked at him with shining eyes, waiting for the gift she knew he would bring. But this time there was no carefully wrapped box, no strange object that seemed to come from a fairy tale. Instead, her father smiled and took out something wrapped in a simple handkerchief. "This is special, Lexi," he said as he carefully unwrapped the cloth. Inside, there was a small bird, a black chick with big, bright eyes that seemed to observe everything with curiosity. It was weak, with still messy feathers and wings that could barely move. "It's a raven. I found it at the port. It was lost and needed help. I thought you could take care of it." Lexi frowned at first. A bird wasn't like the shells or exotic figures she used to receive. It was something alive, something that required attention and time. "Why a raven, Papa?" she asked, her small fingers brushing the bird's soft plumage. "Because you have a big heart," replied her father, bending down to her level. "And I know that if anyone can give it what it needs, it's you." For a moment, Lexi didn't know what to say. But when the raven made a small sound, as if asking for something, her expression changed. She carefully held it in her hands and brought it to her chest, feeling the bird's fragile warmth against her skin. At that moment, she understood that this gift was different, but perhaps more important than any she had received before. As they walked together towards the house, Lexi's father told her about what he had learned about ravens. "They are intelligent, more than you imagine," he said. "If you take good care of it, it will not just be a bird, it will be a friend." That night, while the little raven rested in a box her mother had prepared with soft blankets, Lexi stared at it, thinking about her father's words. "A friend," she murmured to herself. And although she didn't know it yet, that little raven would change her life in a way that no one in that small village could imagine. The next day, When the first rays of sun crept through her bedroom window, Lexi woke up with the same curiosity that had accompanied her all her life. She tiptoed out of bed, trying not to make any noise, and walked to the box where the little raven rested. As she approached, she found it awake, with its bright black eyes that seemed to observe everything. It made a slight sound, a barely audible caw, which made the girl smile. "Good morning, little one," she whispered, carefully extending a hand. The raven didn't move away, but neither did it move towards her. It seemed to be measuring each movement, as if evaluating the intention behind each gesture. "Don't worry, we'll be friends, you'll see." Her mother entered the room shortly after with a small container filled with crushed corn and a few drops of water. "Look, daughter, it might like this, but you have to be patient. Sometimes animals need time to trust." Lexi nodded seriously, as if it were a very important task. With trembling but firm hands, she took a handful of the mixture and placed it in front of the raven. At first, the bird simply looked at it, tilting its head from side to side, but then, with a quick movement, it took some food with its beak. Lexi held her breath, amazed. There was something magical in that small interaction, something she couldn't explain but felt deeply in her chest. That day, she spent long hours sitting next to the box, watching the raven eat, drink, and begin to get used to her presence. As the days passed, the routine between them became almost sacred. Lexi spoke to it softly while feeding it and filling the small container of water that her mother had put in the box. Little by little, the raven began to emerge from its makeshift shelter, walking with uncertain steps on the floor of the room. Sometimes it spread its wings, flapping them as if it wanted to test their strength. One afternoon, while the sun illuminated the back garden, Lexi decided to take the raven out of the house. "Come on, I want you to see how beautiful it is outside," she said, carefully carrying it in her hands. She placed it on the ground near a tree and sat down to watch. For a moment, the raven seemed confused, but soon began to explore, pecking at the earth and looking at the sky as if something was calling it. "Do you think you'll fly someday, little one?" Lexi asked, though she knew she wouldn't get an answer. However, in her heart, she felt that the bird understood more than it seemed. Weeks later, the day arrived that would change their relationship forever. They were in the garden, as usual, when the raven spread its wings and, with a clumsy but determined effort, managed to lift itself off the ground. It wasn't a long flight, just a few seconds before falling again, but for Lexi, it was a magical moment. "You did it!" she shouted, clapping enthusiastically. The raven, as if understanding her joy, emitted a sharp sound and tried again. Every day it practiced more, until finally it was able to soar gracefully, crossing the sky of the small village. However, what amazed Lexi most was not that it could fly, but that it always came back. No matter how far the raven strayed, it always returned to her, landing softly on her shoulder or on the window frame. That connection, invisible but unbreakable, made the girl feel that she was not alone, even when her father left again for the sea. "Why do you always come back?" she asked one day, as the raven perched on her arm. The answer was in the brightness of its black eyes, in the way it tilted its head as if listening to her. It was as if the bird wanted to tell her that there was something deeper between them, something that didn't need words. Eventually, Lexi stopped calling it simply the raven. One day, while they were playing in the garden, she decided to give it a name. "I'll call you Raven," she declared, with a smile. "It's a special name, like you." Raven became a constant presence in Lexi's life. It wasn't just an animal to care for, it was a friend, a companion that helped her understand the value of responsibility and the importance of connection with living beings. Her mother, seeing her so dedicated, often said, "That raven has taught you more than any adult could." And although Lexi didn't quite understand it yet, She knew there was something extraordinary about the relationship she shared with Raven. When she saw it fly, she felt a mixture of pride and happiness that filled her little heart. It was as if, by taking care of it, she was also taking care of a part of herself that she was just beginning to discover. Every night, before going to sleep, Lexi went to the window to make sure Raven was nearby. And it was always there, perched on the tallest tree in the garden, watching over her as if it were her guardian. It was one of those afternoons when the sun seemed warmer than usual, spilling its light on every corner of the small garden. Lexi ran barefoot through the grass, her crystalline laughter filling the air. Raven, the faithful Raven, stayed close, watching from the lowest branch of a large tree that shaded the garden. That tree, with its wide trunk and spreading branches, was their favorite place, the setting for 1,000 games and adventures invented by her childish imagination. While playing, something caught Lexi's attention. Under the tree, there were several nuts, some still in their hard shells, others already open, showing their shiny, smooth seeds. She bent down curiously, taking one in her small hands. "What is this, Raven?" she murmured, although she knew she wouldn't get an answer. Under the Raven's watchful gaze, Lexi inspected the nut. It was rounded, smooth, and had a smell that was strange to her, but not unpleasant. The girl, like any child her age, decided that the best way to explore something new was to try it. She lifted the seed to her lips and took a bite, but the shell was harder than she expected. She persisted, unaware of the danger it would bring. On her third attempt, the seed cracked unexpectedly, and a small piece slipped down her throat. Suddenly Lexi felt a twinge of discomfort that quickly transformed into something more alarming. She tried to cough, but the air didn't flow as before. Her hands instinctively went to her neck as a muffled sound came from her chest. Raven, who was following her every move, reacted immediately. It emitted a sharp cry, a sound that tore through the calm of the afternoon and launched itself from the branch. It circled over Lexi's head, its coal-black wings creating a frenzy in the air. The girl, increasingly weaker, fell to her knees, her gaze fixed on the Raven before collapsing under the tree. The garden, which a few minutes earlier had been a corner of joy, now seemed enveloped in a strange stillness. But Raven didn't stop. Its cries intensified. Its flight became more chaotic, as if it knew that something urgently needed to be done. In the house, Lexi's parents were finishing the day's chores when they heard the Raven's shrieks. It was such an unusual sound that they both looked at each other with concern. "What's going on?" asked the mother, putting aside what she had in her hands. "I'll go see," replied the father, heading to the garden with hurried steps. As soon as he crossed the door, he saw it. The small body of his daughter, motionless under the tree, and the Raven hovering over her as if trying to lift her with its own wings. "Lexi!" shouted the man, running towards her. His wife, alerted by the tone of his voice, followed him, arriving just as he lifted the girl into his arms. "She's not breathing!" he exclaimed, with a mixture of desperation and fear in his eyes. "We have to take her to the hospital now," said the mother, almost pushing him towards the car that was parked in the driveway. Between them, they placed Lexi in the back seat, and as they started the engine, Raven perched on the roof of the vehicle. Its dark eyes did not leave the girl, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. The road to the hospital was a whirlwind of emotions. Lexi's mother kept looking back, as if her tears could bring breath back to her daughter. The father, with his hands firmly on the steering wheel, drove at full speed, ignoring the bumps in the road, and Raven, faithful as ever, flew over the car, refusing to leave her alone. When they arrived, the doctors quickly took Lexi and rushed her to the emergency room. The couple waited outside, embraced in a silence full of unspoken pleas. "She has to be okay," murmured the mother, like a mantra. The doctor came out after a few minutes, his face reflecting more uncertainty than certainty. "We didn't find anything in her lungs," he explained. "It may have been a prolonged lack of oxygen. We'll do more tests, but I fear it's too late." Those words fell on the parents like a hammer. The mother slumped into a chair while the father tried to process what he had just heard. But outside the hospital, a familiar sound broke the tension. It was Raven, insistently pecking at the window with its beak, as if trying to get in. A nurse approached, trying to shoo the raven away, but it refused to move. Its pecking became increasingly frantic, as if it wanted to say something that no one could understand. Inside the room, Lexi's body remained still, but something in the air seemed to change. The small amount of air that could still pass through her throat kept her body in a fragile balance, although no one knew it yet. The return home was a silent and somber journey, a brutal contrast to the speed and desperation with which they had arrived at the hospital just a few hours earlier. Lexi's father drove slowly, his hands steady on the wheel, but his gaze lost on the horizon. The mother, sitting next to him, had her hands clasped in her lap, squeezing them so tightly that her knuckles were white. No one spoke. The weight of the emptiness that Lexi had left in their lives didn't need to be said. When they finally arrived at the small village, the house that had once been a warm and laughter-filled refuge received them with an almost sepulchral silence. It was as if even the walls knew that something was broken, that someone was missing. The father opened the door slowly, letting the mother enter first. He looked around the living room, and in every corner he saw traces of his daughter. The drawings she had made, her favorite doll abandoned in a corner, and the small container where she gave water to Raven, the raven. The mother sank into a chair, unable to contain her tears. "How did this happen?" she murmured between sobs, more to herself than to her husband. "How did she leave us so quickly?" The father, still standing near the door, had no answer. He knew there were not enough words to soothe the pain of losing a child. Instead of speaking, he closed his eyes, trying to gather strength for what was to come, preparing the last goodbye for Lexi. Meanwhile, Raven had not abandoned the house. Since the car arrived, the raven had settled on a nearby branch, watching the family's every move. It emitted a low, repetitive sound that wasn't exactly a caw, but something softer, like a lament. It seemed to know that something was wrong, deeply wrong, and its constant presence only accentuated the parents' pain. The next morning, the house was filled with a silent coming and going. Lexi's father had brought a small wooden coffin, simple but beautiful, with carved details that resembled wildflowers. They placed it in the center of the room, where neighbors and friends from the village began to arrive to pay their respects. Lexi's mother, her eyes swollen from crying, carefully arranged her daughter's hair and smoothed the white dress she had chosen for her. Each movement was a struggle against the torrent of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "She looks so peaceful," she said softly, stroking Lexi's cheek. But that peace wasn't a comfort. It was a cruel reminder that her little girl was no longer with them. The neighbors filled the room with their murmurs and prayers. Each one brought something: flowers, food, words of comfort. However, amidst all this activity, Raven remained a disturbing presence. It flew from one window to another, looking inside as if searching for something. Some of the attendees began to notice it. "It's strange for a raven to be so close," commented an elderly woman adjusting her shawl. "They say they bring messages, but they can also be a bad omen." Another neighbor, younger, shook her head. "That raven was always with the girl. It's like it's watching over her, even now." But the neighbor's words were just a distant murmur for Lexi's parents, who couldn't take their eyes off their daughter. Although they tried to ignore it, they couldn't help but notice the raven's persistence. There was something in the way it cawed and in its constant movements that made them feel it was trying to tell them something. The day of the funeral dawned with a sky covered in grey clouds, as if even the universe shared the grief that had settled in the small home of Lexi's family. The streets of the village were unusually quiet, and the air seemed heavy, imbued with sadness. In the main room of the house, the small wooden coffin was surrounded by white flowers and candles that flickered timidly, casting restless shadows on the walls. Neighbors and friends arrived in silence, each leaving flowers or a plate of food as a token of respect. There were tears on almost every face, and the murmurs of prayers filled the air. Some leaned over the coffin, looked at Lexi's pale face, and quickly left, unable to bear the sight. The girl, although motionless, seemed to be asleep, her white dress carefully smoothed by her mother, and her hair arranged with a ribbon she herself had chosen days before. Lexi's mother remained close, standing by the coffin, her face marked by sleepless nights and incessant weeping. Her husband, on the other hand, remained seated in a corner, his hands clasped, staring at the floor. Although both were surrounded by supportive neighbors, the truth was that grief isolated them, as if there were an invisible wall separating them from everything else. Outside, on one of the highest branches of the tree that shaded the garden, Raven watched everything in silence. The raven, which had witnessed every moment since Lexi's accident, remained vigilant, its black eyes shining with a disturbing intensity. Some of the attendees began to notice its presence. "It's strange that Raven is still here," murmured an old woman to her neighbor. "They say ravens bring messages from the dead. Maybe it's waiting to take something." "Nonsense, just superstitions," replied the other, although she couldn't help but glance quickly towards the tree. Meanwhile, the family barely noticed the conversations that arose around them. But everything changed when Raven decided to leave its place on the branch. With a determined flapping of its wings, it flew to the frame of the open window and, from there, let out a caw that resonated throughout the room. "Look, the raven!" exclaimed a child, pointing at it. The raven didn't wait. With quick and elegant movements, it crossed the room and perched directly on the small coffin. The sound of its claws against the wood broke the silence, and a murmur of surprise ran through those present. Lexi's mother stepped back, placing a hand on her chest. "What is it doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'll get it out," said the father, standing up abruptly. But before he could approach, Raven began to move in a strange way. The raven walked around the coffin, turning its head from side to side as if inspecting something. Then it stopped just above Lexi's face and emitted a low sound, almost like a whisper. No one dared to move. The scene was so unexpected that it seemed unreal. "This isn't right," said an older man from the back of the room. "That bird should leave. It's disrespectful." However, before anyone could do anything, Raven tilted its head and began to gently peck at the girl's lips. The dry sound of its beak hitting her skin sent shivers through the attendees, and some even looked away. "Stop!" exclaimed the mother, moving towards the coffin. But the father stopped her, raising a hand. "Wait," he said softly. There was something in the raven's gaze that puzzled him, something he couldn't ignore. The raven, without taking its eyes off Lexi, moved its head from side to side as if analyzing something invisible to others. Its beak, firm and determined, began to tap the girl's lips again. Each tap resonated in the small room, and with each one, the murmurs of those present increased. "This isn't normal," someone said from the back, their voice trembling between astonishment and fear. Lexi's father, although his instincts told him to intervene, couldn't ignore the feeling that the raven knew exactly what it was doing. "Leave it," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. Raven, as if understanding that everything depended on that moment, gave one last peck, stronger and more precise than the previous ones. Then it tilted its head and inserted its beak inside the girl's mouth. The air in the room became unbearably thick. No one dared to breathe. Suddenly, the raven raised its head and dropped something on the floor. It was a shiny, moist fragment. A nut. Its smooth surface reflected the candlelight, and in that instant, everything made sense. Lexi, who had remained motionless until then, let out a weak gasp. Her chest rose and fell slightly as if air was slowly returning to her lungs. Her lips, which were previously pale and rigid, began to move slightly, letting out a thread of voice that was barely audible. "She's moving!" cried the mother, kneeling beside the coffin as tears streamed down her face. "My girl is alive!" The father joined her, his trembling hands caressing his daughter's face. "Lexi, my love, we're here," he said, his voice choked with emotion. The neighbors, who had been watching everything in incredulous silence, erupted in murmurs and exclamations. Some cried, others crossed themselves, and all shared the same feeling of witnessing something extraordinary. Raven, meanwhile, moved away from the coffin. With a couple of strong flaps of its wings, it flew towards the open window, but didn't leave. It perched on the frame, watching the family with a gaze that almost seemed human, as if it knew its task wasn't completely finished yet. "Take her to the hospital," shouted one of the neighbors. "She needs to see a doctor." The father, wasting no time, lifted Lexi into his arms. Although still weak, the girl opened her eyes and looked at him, as if trying to recognize his face. It was enough for him. "She's alive. That's all that matters," he whispered as he headed for the door. At the hospital, the doctors received them with looks of surprise and confusion. "Isn't this the girl?" one of them began, but the father interrupted him with a firm voice. "She's alive. Help her." After a thorough examination, the head doctor approached the family. His face was serious, but also with a touch of embarrassment. "The nut was partially blocking her throat," he explained. "That reduced the airflow enough to make it seem like she had passed away. Her body was in such a weak state that vital signs were almost imperceptible. It was a mistake not to check her more thoroughly. I'm very sorry." The mother, although relieved to have her daughter back, couldn't help but feel a touch of indignation. "If it hadn't been for that Raven," she murmured, but didn't finish the sentence. At that moment, gratitude outweighed any reproach. The doctor nodded, looking at the father. "If it hadn't been for that intervention, your daughter wouldn't have survived. It's a unique case." The return home was unlike anything the family had imagined hours before. The fresh evening air filled the car cabin, and every so often, the father looked in the rearview mirror at Lexi, who was resting in the back seat with her head on her mother's lap. Although her movements were slow and her eyes could barely stay open, the girl was alive, breathing, and that was more than they had dared to hope for. Upon arriving, the sky was beginning to turn orange and pink. The house, which until that morning had seemed an empty place filled with pain, now welcomed them with a new sense of hope. The father carried Lexi in his arms and took her directly to her room, placing her on the bed with the delicacy of someone holding something fragile and precious. The mother, meanwhile, prepared warm water and chamomile tea, following the advice of the neighbors who had arrived shortly after to offer help. "How are you feeling, my love?" asked the mother, sitting on the edge of the bed and gently stroking Lexi's forehead. "I feel tired," replied the girl in a weak but clear voice. Then she turned her head towards the window, where Raven was perched, watching her with its bright black eyes. "But I'm okay. He looked after me." The mother followed her gaze and, for the first time, smiled at the sight of the Raven. "Yes, my girl. He never left your side." The following days were a period of recovery filled with moments that the family would cherish forever. Lexi, although still a little weak, quickly regained her energy thanks to her parents' constant care. Every morning, Raven woke her with a soft caw from the window, and every night it made sure to be in the nearest tree, like a watchful guardian. One afternoon, while they were playing in the garden, Lexi decided to tell her parents what she remembered. "When I was asleep," she said, sitting in the shade of the tree, "I felt like I couldn't breathe, but I wasn't alone. Raven was there. I could hear him, even though I couldn't see him. I knew he wouldn't leave me." The father, who was fixing a broken chair near them, looked up and nodded. "He's a special Raven. There's no doubt about that," he murmured, although inside he was still amazed by everything that had happened. The story of Lexi and Raven didn't take long to spread throughout the village. The neighbors, who had initially looked at the Raven with distrust, now considered it a hero. People of all ages came to the family's house to hear the story directly from the girl's lips. "Is it true that the Raven never left your side?" asked an elderly woman holding a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked on the way. "Yes," replied Lexi with a mixture of shyness and pride in her voice. "He was there even when no one else knew I was still here. He knew." Raven, as if understanding that they were talking about him, used to perch nearby during these visits. His elegant black figure commanded respect, but his eyes shone with an intelligence that no one could deny. Some looked at him with fascination, while others, still clinging to old superstitions, kept their distance. But over time, even the most skeptical began to change their perception. What they once considered a dark omen was now seen as a symbol of loyalty and courage. The children of the village began to imitate the Raven's call while playing, and the elderly, sitting on the benches in the square, spoke of Raven with a tone of reverence. Meanwhile, Lexi continued to grow. Although the memories of that day would never completely fade, she learned to carry them with pride, as a constant reminder of the fragility and beauty of life. Every day was an opportunity to discover something new, and she always did it with Raven by her side. One afternoon, while walking through the countryside, she stopped to watch a group of birds soaring together into the sky. "Would you like to fly with them?" she asked the Raven, which remained on her shoulder. Raven turned its head and emitted a soft caw as if trying to answer her. "I think so," Lexi continued. "But you always come back. Always." The Raven tilted its head towards her, and Lexi felt a wave of warmth wash over her from head to toe. She knew that the connection between them was something unique, something that didn't need words to be understood. At home, the relationship between her parents had also changed. The experience of almost losing their daughter had taught them to value what was essential, putting aside the worries that previously occupied so much space in their lives. Now they dedicated more time to being together, to sharing the small joys of everyday life, to truly listening to each other. One night, while having dinner as a family, Lexi's father looked up from his plate and said, "You know, my love, that Raven taught us more than I think we'll ever understand." The mother, nodding, added, "It reminded us that there are things beyond our explanation, and that sometimes miracles don't take the form we expect." Lexi smiled as she stroked Raven's feathers, who was perched on the back of her chair. "I also think it's a miracle," she said softly. Over time, the story of Lexi and Raven became more than just an anecdote to tell, but a symbol of something much deeper. In the village, they began to look at animals with different eyes, recognizing in them the possibility of a connection beyond the physical. Birds, previously ignored or feared, were now observed with curiosity and respect. And although the visits from strangers eventually diminished, the impact of the story remained. Those who heard it carried it with them, like a seed planted in the heart, ready to grow in moments of doubt or uncertainty. For Lexi, her friendship with Raven remained the center of her world. Years passed, and although the girl became a young woman with new interests and responsibilities, she always found time to sit with her feathered friend, sharing with him her thoughts, her joys, and even her deepest fears. "You'll always be my guardian," she once said, as they watched the sunset together from the highest hill in the village. And although the Raven didn't answer with words, its presence was all she needed to know that she would never be alone. The story of Lexi and Raven was inscribed in the collective memory of the village, not only as a tale of survival, but as a lesson about trust, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between human beings and nature. And although the years continued to pass, the echo of that call that saved a life continued to resonate in the hearts of all who ever heard it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and accompany you every step of the way.